Good evening, cousins, and welcome to another episode of the Shattersong LARP Diaries. Today we've got a guest on, technically a returning guest, but I think this is at least 2 years or more at this point. But I've got my mate Dave on today, and we're going to be talking about a variety of different things. But first, I'll let Dave introduce yourself to people who don't know who you are.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for getting me back on podcast. Lovely to be back. I'm David Turner Moth. I play a number of different systems. I crew for a lot of ILOP games. You probably see me trying to attempt to murder your character at various points at ILOP. I play Riz Dancewalker, one of the Devar generals in Empire. And I've done various kind of Eurolops and a few other bits. So just really enjoy the hobby. Really enjoy having all the kind of fun and nerddom that comes with it, and really just enjoy new concepts, ideas, and stories. It's a really fantastic hobby and an amazing bunch of people.
Mm. And it's actually how we met as well. I think it's the I guess we could call each other sort of, but prior to actually knowing each other face to face at LARPs, almost like fourth level associates. There's a proper word for it. I can't remember. Like 4 degrees of separation. That was it. Of you've been LARPing since university, right? With the same group of friends.
Yeah, I got into LARPing like through reenactment actually. A mate of mine was just like one weekend was just like we crew, do you want free beer? And that's kind of how it began.
Yeah, because we met in Black Scar, right? At
We did, yeah,
I'm gonna say 2016.
yeah. A lifetime
20.
ago, mate.
Yeah, I'm gonna say actually 20 because my first events were 2015, and you were already playing at that point, of course. And I think it was maybe 2018 or 19 before we started to actually interact as characters, and following on from that, interacting as mates, right? But it goes to show that the those degrees of separation when we don't have the same jobs, we don't live in the same area, and then bang, LARP brings it together, and unsurprisingly, doing a hobby with people who also enjoy the same hobbies of you, there seems to be a lot of crossover as well. And the the intent for this episode today is basically to chat shit and see how many things we can cross over. I've got Menhirs Fate on the list. I've got Warhammer on the list as well. Of course, we're going to talk about Empire because I've got some questions for a general's point of view, and also some bigger questions around the hobby itself. Because I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think we're actually entering quite an exciting time where we've now got another Festlarp on the market. The prior three Festlarps, so LT, CP, and Empire, are there at the sort of 10, 15 year mark now. And I know there's been games like Odyssey and Maelstrom before that as well. These businesses clearly have consistently been able to exist and grow. But now we've got a new player in the field, a brand new one. And do you have any hope or optimism for LARPing as an industry, as a sector, in the next, let's say, 5 years?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the arrival of Menhirs Fate on the kind of scene is huge because it offers not only a bit of a fresh take on LARP, which, let's be honest, was getting a bit kind of samey, right? I mean, there was very few large-scale festival systems in the UK. We've got Empire, you've got LT, and you've got CP, Curious Pastimes. Um, and they've all three of those have been around for a long time. I'm going to say over a decade, if not 15, 20 years at this point. So kind of it's nice to see a bit of an update on the take of it. Stories that go into LARP and the kind of view on fantasy has evolved a lot in kind of social kind of acceptance. So if you think kind of way back, 10, 20 years ago, you were really looking at kind of David Gemmel's book on the Draenei or kind of original Lord of the Rings, and that was sort of it. Whereas now we have things like Harry Potter, we have multiple books on, Warhammer, we have like tons and tons and tons of different kind of fantasy realms, all of which are kind of mean we've got a much richer kind of diversity of stories, which means you have not only a greater literature kind of base to base your LARPs on, but we've also got all the changes that come with it. So you can have better access to technology, you can better design your rules system to be more open and inclusive, you can have kind of updated conduct policies and rules, which means the game plays better and you can have a more kind of free flowing system, you can have a better kind of ease of how like people XP and level up their characters, all of this
Mm.
kind of stuff super accepting. And it's super exciting because it's crucial that, you know, the game of the culture of LARP evolves as society evolves. So it's great that we're kind of seeing Menhirs Fate come on the scene, and it will really hopefully have two effects. One is a brand new system, which is super exciting, and then the second one is really just to shake up the existing ones to kind of get them to rethink some of their approaches to stuff.
Yeah, so I'm actually quite optimistic for Menhirs Fate. I started off this year with an episode saying, "Will everyone please leave Menhirs Fate alone?" If you remember that meme from what was it? At least 15 years ago, like please leave Justin Bieber alone. Same vibe here. With I think it's a lot of it is fairly recognizable, or at least in the same bedrock as Empire, because that's the only Fest I've played, so that's what I'm comparing it to. But then the areas where it differs, I think, are broadly improvements, and I actually think it's a decent rule set so far. Again, I haven't comprehensively read it all, but I'm working through it bit by bit, and what I'm seeing, I'm liking. But in your opinion, do you think there's well, maybe not your opinion, but do you have any hopes from Menhirs Fate? Is there anything you're hoping it will fix in the LARP space? For me, just to give you an example, it's the keeping the admin IC rather than OC. You've got that banking guild that does your XP or leveling up or submitting cash and resources, and rather than being in a god tent, that tent is in the smack bang at the middle of the field, and the people in there will do that admin, those mechanics to make the game run, but they'll do it in character, and I think that's fantastic from a immersion and role playing perspective as well. Because if you're new, you're a bit bored, maybe you just want to do some admin, or your friends have said, "Oh, can you go do X, Y, or Z for me, please?" You're like, "Yeah, sure, I can go submit this." You're still getting a player experience whilst doing so. Whilst at again, let's take Empire. You've got to walk all the way to the edge of the field. You got to wait in a 20, maybe 10, 20-minute queue, do the thing, walk back on the field, and you think, oh, crikey, right, what was I doing? Snap your fingers, ah, yes, off I go. And then, of course, everyone's already fucking moved by that point as well. So that's one thing I've seen so far. But have you seen anything else or heard anything else that you really like and you think is going to really work for Menhirs Fate?
So I think it adds a from the get go. You've got a very different kind of plot delivery system, right? You've got the guilds as like your primary plot element. There's obviously this ability. There's going to be options for giving nation plot as well. So you've already got a different way of approaching plot than say Empire,
Mm.
which is really exciting. And as you said, kind of moving the admin on the field is also much more exciting. Although that is going to be really challenging because one of the advantages of having a dedicated god desk is you can obviously have all your kind of your laptops, your printers, your boxes of resources, and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be really difficult. So in terms of how you do that on the field, you're going to have to sort of have the curtain across it, as it were, and you have your front of house and your back of house. So there will still be the mechanics of running a games desk will still be on the field. You just won't necessarily see it as a kind of character. But that's exciting, as you said. Like you're not going to have the Empire problem where, let's say, your character dies and you're in a big battle, you have to go then queue up for God to go and get a new character, and that can take in some worst cases like an hour and 45 minutes. The
Yeah,
whole
it
time
did.
you're not actually on the field, right?
Yeah, when we got massacred in the Plague skirmish at E4, we no, sorry, it was E2 last year when or was it even E1? It was when no, it was E1. It's when Lindir died. Was that absolute massacre of all the champions, and there was about, admittedly, it's not common, but there was maybe 20, 25 dead players, and the queue
Yep.
was just dreadful. Like it's absolutely dreadful. Like peak of a Saturday night, we lost nearly an hour, like you said, nearly an hour and a half of RP at that point.
Yeah, and that's I think the effect I think should be exciting from Menace Fate is like changing up the dynamic, because one of the big problems that all the established systems have is that they've rested on their laurels for a bit, but also they're also struggling in terms of their resources for kind of providing that back of house, right? Do they have enough staff to kind of come in, and do you have enough crew, and that's really difficult, right? And how do your systems work, and like are your character creation screens okay, or is it super clunky? Like do you have to log into a separate portal and all that kind of stuff? So Managed Fate will really allow an opportunity to kind of reset that a bit and give it a bit of an update. So you have like, I don't know, an intuitive app. You've kind of got you'll permanently have crew there because you'll have NPCs kind of around the whole time, but then it's not just them in a polo shirt smashing out, character sheets, they'll be able to also interact as a character. So that's itself far more exciting. As if you do crew, one of the hardest bits is you don't really want to always be doing the admin jobs because it is basically doing another job on your weekend. So that's exciting from a crew perspective as well. So yeah, it's gonna be really interesting. I think I'll be honest, the bits that I find really interesting in Menhirs Fate was also where they've kind of deliberately opted in some elements. So, for example, the Thieves Guild is a really interesting one.
Yep.
And indeed, the discussion around PvP and whether or not having a title and whether or not you are open to be potentially targeted, and that I think is a really interesting one because one of the big questions I've always had in Menhirs Fate was it's explicitly PvE, right? You're all working together against a big background of at the end of the world kind of deal.
Yeah, the
But
darkness I
it's
think is, or yeah, something similar. It's a bit vague from what I've seen so far.
the corruption.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes. The problem you're going to find is that in any LARP game, in any board game, there's always finite resources, right? So think Monopoly, like you're flipping tables because you don't have enough money, right? Or your brother's nicked it from the bank or whatever, right? Same thing in LARP. And so one of the big problems is that you will always get conflict in a game. And it's how do you manage that conflict, right? And I'm not advocating the kind of bad old days of Maelstrom or LT or anything else, where you go to the toilet and you get shanked at a cubicle. That's not fun for anybody because it also doesn't tell a story. It was like, what happened to you? I got shanked at a toilet cubicle. Great, cool story, bro. Whereas if you actually go, okay, look, I did this thing, and I got some cool magic together, and I exploded. That's a far more interesting story, right? Like, why did you explode? What happened? Or I got whisked away to to another realm or whatever. So I'm really interested to see how that plays out, and crucially how the players interact with that. And if you're going to have say opt-in thievery, how does that Thieves Guild's going to be super interesting. If you run for title like political assassination, how does is that going to be the game or not? These things are really interesting. I know they haven't fully worked them all out yet, but the fact they've even explicitly said we're putting them in is super exciting.
Yeah, and having that clear expectation as well. I've let's say across the last, like, let's call it post COVID, I've seen a shift to Empire of I think we saw a kind of resolution from PD, which is basically conditions and competition for seats. And let's use generals as an example. They're a non-martial position as would be defined now. But prior to that, there were some question marks over: do generals take the field? Do they not take the field? What does that mean for less able-bodied players? And it wasn't defined. So someone would come on and like, hello, my name's Joffrey Baratheon, and I'm a super I don't know. I'm picking Joffrey Baratheon here. My name is the Hound, and I've killed 60 people with my bare hands, let alone with a weapon. You all know me, and because I'm a murder machine, I should be the best general. And then someone comes, like let's say Littlefinger comes up, master of strategy and long-term convoluted plans, and coming out on top. So, well, I'm also a good fit for general, but I won't be taking the field because of reasons X, Y, or Z. And then there was that question mark over what, as characters, as citizens inside the Empire, what should matter more. The martial role slash non-martial roles kind of addressed that, but it was I feel it felt very reactionary to me. It contrasts very strongly with here at Menhirs Fate, where it's like, yeah, if you go for a hat, people are going to want that because you wanted it at some point, right? And unless you're an E1 player, year one E1 player, which admittedly we're going to be, you probably took that hat off somebody else. So logically, someone else is going to come and take it off you at some point, and you've got to be ready for that role play and embrace it, right? You got to embrace it for the friction and conflict it is. Even though it's a PvE setting, that's the combat. I still really hope that there's going to be some political PvP within Menhirs, because bluntly, that's what makes Empire so special and so good. I still think it's fundamentally a good game. It's the intra. Is that the right way of saying it? Intra or inter? I was going to say interpersonal skills or intrapersonal skills. And I remember my teacher in PSHE screaming at me about this, and he's going to be so upset that I've forgotten it. But my point being, interpersonal skills that you get to pull out the box and get to develop as part of that PvP political roleplay. It's fun. It's really fun, and I really hope they keep it for Menhirs, at least in some capacity.
Yes, I mean it's a good question. So I think those elements are really important to keep in the game. I think it's one of the hardest issues around. If we got right back to the sort of core of a question of any title in Empire, there are some discrepancies and variations here in terms of how nations elect titles, but broadly it's a popularity contest, right?
Mm.
You have to be a political character who's able to secure money or votes or backing from the benefactors or from your chapters or whatever it might be, or straight up you just give a good speech, right? And the variances between the nations are there deliberately. They're a feature, not a bug. And so one of the things I find really irritating with empires when people are like, oh, well, so and so nation has a better system. Yeah, they might, but they also have a worse system in other ways, right? And the variances are meant to be there deliberately to drive friction in the game. They're the grit deliberately put in between the wheels that makes it interesting, right? It's meant to be that, Varishka has more resources than Dawn, off the top of my head, and that's deliberately there in that, yeah, if you want to have a load of money, you're probably going to be attracted to Varishka or the League or whoever, but you don't have the martial capability. So actually, you realise that Dawn has an overwhelmingly kind of martial element to it. They have all the most military units, I think, in the game, or maybe it's Wintermonk now. But there are very martial nations. So logically, there, if you've got something I want and I have the money, I'll buy it from you, right?
Mm.
And that's exciting. That's a feature, not a bug of the game. So I think it's really interesting. I think it's really important that you have this grit because it encourages the conversation between nations and encourages the friction between nations. Like, we're not meant to necessarily agree on stuff. We're bound in the Empire to have the same outward-facing views, largely, but inter-Empire friction is super interesting. And one of the great stories I love in the Empire is like the friction, say, in the Marches about, you know, do they succeed from the Empire? Do they not? Like, protection of their land, but what if their land is, the best way to protect it or their people is to give it to someone else, and
Mm.
therefore is the Empire bad because they destroyed the Morn world and all that kind of stuff is amazing because that's the great story. So yeah, I think with Menhirs Fate, if we apply all of that to Menhirs Fate, I'm really hoping that we do get a bit of that friction on PvP, particularly within the guild system, because that's where you're going to get a far greater kind of D&D Vox Machina style approach of
Mm.
just different people from different nations coming together. And that's where alliances between different nations is going to be interesting. Alliances between different guilds is going to be super interesting. And then, as you said, the blend of whether or not they need to be martial or non-martial roles. I personally think you need both. I think the path to, say, being a general in Empire, if you're very good at strategy or very good at forming alliances, you need to figure out what you're good at to be able to compete with it. So if you're well known on the battlefield for being loud and able to organize people and whatever, yes, being a martial fighter isn't relevant for the role of general, but the fact is people know that you're competent at doing something. So competence in LARP is something that does become a recognizable quality, even if it's not expressly in the game. Like, if you're known that this is the person who deals with X, right? So let's say you wanted to be a cardinal, well, cardinal's a good example. Like, if you're known as being a competent priest who puts forward like constant changes of doctrine, or is trying to convince people about the way, or is actively kind of trying to support a particular issue in the Empire, that's the way you'll become cardinal, because people will know who you are, right, within your assembly.
Mm.
Same thing with martial combat in the Empire. You don't have to be martial, and explicitly you don't have to be in the rules. But what is your USP that you bring to an election? I think is the key thing I often come back to.
Absolutely. I went and googled the difference between interpersonal and intrapersonal. Interpersonal is what you'd expect between yourself and other people, but intrapersonal is focusing within a person's own mind. So intra meaning within, literally. So it's how well you understand yourself and you know what your strengths and weaknesses are. So that was going to be my point of, if you've got like you just mentioned, the competency to know what you're good at and then apply it to getting a hat. I think what Menhirs Fate has done really well is define that, right, you've done that, great, that's the correct process for acquiring a hat, but you need to know and be aware that someone else very similar to you will come and try and take that hat off you, and that is part of the game. So once you've got it, don't expect to keep it and rest on your laurels. You've very much got to fight for it, and you've got to continuously prove that you're the right person for that hat. And without that going OC, of course, I think that's my big differentiator here. Is if it's all dealt with as a rule of the game, it's kept in game, and then, like, unfortunately, lots of things in LARP's JOC. I hope my hope for Menhirs Fate is that by stating these attitudes and these expectations nice and clearly, we keep more to game IC and less OC. Fingers crossed.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's one of the big problems, right? I mean, um, people are inherently, they want to hold on to an advantage, right? So
Mm, of
if
course you do. You've worked hard for it, right?
right, exactly. So and then the problem comes of okay, how do people bow out from having a title or bow in for having a title? I think is one of the most hardest issues of any game because I'd say if we using Empire as an example, one of the most difficult issues with Empire is that if you have a title as a senator, senator has such an impact on the game for your fellow players. There's kind of almost like an OC-IC contract signed there, right? You're opting in to get a title. Congratulations, you've won the title. But your interaction with the game makes plot for the people, right? Like the funding of that army, or like maybe you need to get something to Synod, or you need to get something agreed to your nation, and the more controversial you want to go, the more game you're generating, right? And the harder it is to get done. But there's an issue there with it. If you're competent at a title, doesn't matter what you are. Like you could be the best, you could be the best militia member. You could be a like non-imperial title, but it's still a technically working title of the empire. You could be an amazing
Like
general, great.
the Strategos, for example, right?
Right. You could be an amazing adjutant. You could be an amazing cardinal. You could be an amazing mage, whatever it might be. The problem is that when there's often a difficulty when, let's say, you want to I want to beat you, right? You're the Grand Master of whatever, right? And I want to beat you. There's often a question of like the OC-IC friction coming into it. So like OC, I want that job because I want to play the character with that title, right? But then the problem is that IC, I've only got like two events under my belt. Like I don't really know how this works, but I think I'm better than you. And that's where the kind of reverse bleed happens of like OC, I want this, therefore it should happen. And it's not fair that you've been in this title for 3 years. But then I see within the world, your character is an established, known entity who's competent because they must have been to hold on to the title for 3 years. But at what point do you, as Chris, the OC person, feel that you need to step down to hand over to someone new? And I think that's one of the most interesting and hardest bits in any festival system is A, the fairness of the title game, but B, the impact those titles have on the other players around them. For example, if you were to suddenly click fingers elected tomorrow and you're a senator in Empire, there's a lot of expectation that comes with that around what do you do as senator. There's a whole lot of procedural requirements you have to follow in very set timings that PD require you to comply with in order to get motions and stuff in. But the effect you have on the game for not being effective in some cases can devastate a whole load of other players' game, or indeed increase it, depending on what you do. So there's a lot of kind of friction around that isn't always easy to navigate when you've got large numbers of people and very high expectations that they feel owed to have a title. And no one's owed a title, you very much it's about competition in game, and that's the beauty of things like Empire and the beauty of things like Menhirs Fate is there is deliberately competition. It's meant to be unfair.
Yeah, I was going to pick up the word fair there because when you've got 3,000 players, there's even with an established system, there's no way you could get that many people through those titles in a meaningful way with let's say a one event tenure each. You're still looking at multiple years before it's your turn. So yeah, I think I think I'm not going to use think. I hope what Menhirs does by we saw today, right? They've just released a bunch of new more in-depth briefs for 3 of the nations, and Urdreven's one of them. So I'm very thankful for that. Thank you very much, Menhirs. Love it. I gave it a quick flick before hopping on, and it looks kind of cool. But what I really hope that Menhirs Fate does is it doesn't even address or expect there to be this idea of fairness and stepping up and stepping down, because fundamentally LARP isn't fair. It's whether it's PvE or PvP, you are always going to either come across an opponent weaker than you or stronger than you, and very rarely is it going to be a fair fight. And then the obvious outcome happens. If you're better than them, you win it, you take it. But if you're not, then no one's going, unless you have, like you said earlier, you've gone and built that network, built that support. If your own merits one-on-one doesn't beat them, then you're not going to get that title. And I really hope that players understand that and sign up to that social contract as part of playing the game. I really hope so. I really hope so. Because
I
the
do too,
oh no,
because
go on.
it's critical. Right? Like it's if you one of the problems I have with kind of LARP at the moment is that there's a lot of kind of bleeding happening between or around the social contract. So I was discussing it the other day with some very experienced, fantastic role players, um, and we were having this discussion around the social contract and what was and wasn't acceptable. And let's say hypothetically you're a grandmaster and you decide, you know what, I need to do this thing. It's vital to my particular agenda or to save the emperor or whatever. So I'm going to curse this territory, right? And the effect of that is a territory of the empire is cursed or whatever it might be, or the effect of that game you're playing is that someone has effectively directly screwed over the place where you're coming from and that affects your resources. Is that fair for you as a new player?
Well, the answer is no. But the
Right.
yeah, the other side of the coin is it never was meant to be. That's the point. You're not. Again, this is where setting expectations is so important. I think we shouldn't be entertaining the idea that players come in thinking it's a fair system in the first place. It's like you are Bumble Scrub 600,008. You've just shown up. Well done. You've taken your first step. Horrible things are going to happen to you sooner or later, and in your example there is very much sooner. But instead of it pushing you down and thinking, great, I hate this system, it sucks for me. I would hope that the LARPer, this theoretical LARPer, would see it as an
Mm.
opportunity to have some. They see it almost as game. They go, oh, great, all my mana crystals have been turned into snot. That's really bad from a financial point of view because I can't afford cake anymore. However, the actual benefit here, because we're all nerds playing in the field, right, is that I now have something to do. I have people to go and rail against, complain, politically maneuver against, hell, maybe even get my knife out and stab them up in the toilets. You've got something to do all of a sudden, rather than here's your 7 mana crystals, go and trade them for exactly 34 rings each, and then use those 34 rings to go and buy resources at slightly less when you're going to sell them, and do that very generic and repetitive economic grind. I think getting screwed over and having an unfair experience is probably going to drive a lot more fun than having a fair experience. Hot take for 2025. I want my
No, I think
I want my
you,
RP to shit me up.
you're totally right, but I think that's the difference, and I guess the social contract in that I LARP because I love the stories, right? And I don't expect to win, and I don't want to win, right? So to highlight, while I currently play General and Empire, I love playing generic characters in Eversley as crew. I love playing just any character, right? So I've done a couple of European LARPs. I've been anything from a Russian peasant to a priest, right? I'm not the main character. I'm a supporting character, right? I have my own story and my own hopes and dreams and loves and losses as the supporting character, but my aim is not to win. There's no such thing as winning in LARP, right? Because you either get the fancy title, cool, great. What are you going to do with it? You're going to play the game. You're going to have access to all the things, all the resources. Congratulations, you're the throne. And then you realize there's downsides to that, right? Because now you are top of the pyramid. Everyone has expectations from you. You have no time to yourself. You're in endless meetings. And at some point, your character will die, right? Or you decide you don't want to do LARP anymore. Those are the only two logical outcomes.
Hmm.
So there's no winning in LARP. Like, you can win temporarily, but the joy is the story, right? Like, if Batman always defeated the Joker, right? There's no story. It's not a comic. It's just like, oh, Batman's punched the Joker and the Joker's in prison. Cool, that's the end of the story, right? It doesn't go anywhere. So the social contract is something that's absolutely at the heart of every LARP, and I think it's something that really needs to be properly engaged with by the player base. Which is, if you are playing a game, you are automatically opting in to that social contract of that game,
Hmm.
right? Which means, in your words, like, it is expected that Varushka will not like the Imperial Orcs, right? It is expected that Valderath will have particularly strong views about other nations in Menhirs Fate, right? Whatever it might be. You are opting into that. That is a deliberate feature of the game. Much like a video game, if you opt in and you're playing like, oh, I'm going to play a half-orc, right? Cool, you're extra strong, but everyone also really doesn't like you because they've suffered at the hand of the orcs, right? And that is a deliberate feature of the game, and I think it's something that we collectively as players need to think about in far more detail about by default, if you're playing that game, you're opting into it,
Mm.
right? You're opting for social contract. You can be screwed over. Your stuff can be stolen. You can be your character could be murdered. All of these things, depending on the game. If they're in the game, you're opting into it by playing it.
Yeah, and 2 points on that. The first is I think a system that does that extremely well is nightmare events at Eversley, where
Yeah.
you are not expected to survive. And how it's not a case of if you die at the event, it's when and how. And the best role play I've ever had, consistently had at the very least, is at those nightmare events. Like, you and I played Now My Watch Has Ended together. We had some really cool little chats. Yourself as a veteran, myself as a new recruit, as a conscript, and then we had a very cool sort of cultist plot line, and with 5 other role players I've never really interacted with in a game. But then, because we all know we're going to die, we're not afraid to die. We lean into those stories, we lean into our characters with just a bit more gusto, and the end result, much, much, much more fun. If I've had to have a funometer, it's on green. The dial is full, 10 out of 10, compared
I love
to yeah, compared to when I was playing Linda at Empire, for example. I don't get me wrong, love playing a character, but I really wanted him to live because I wanted him to do things. I wanted to do things with that character. And when
Mm.
he was killed, I was like really fucking annoyed at first, and it takes a good while to remind yourself and to remind myself, right? It's an intra-personal skill, word of the day, to understand that actually, like you said, there's only two logical conclusions. You stop going to LARP, or that character dies, and just assuming that you're always going to be at the next event and you're always going to be alive at the event after that, and you keep doing plan X, Y, Z, it's that's not the case. And I think if and my second point was going to be Calvari's End. That player event, I
Mm.
think, is this October. Have you seen
Mm.
the content warning list for it?
Yeah,
It's
it's gonna be spicy.
yeah, and all of us as players saw that and went wow. But again, a little bit of reflection on it. I think that should be the standard content warning list for Empire because all of those themes listed there are absolutely in the game. They're not explicitly stated, but they're in there. You look in the wiki, you look at the Winds of War. Hell, you look at the stuff in the Barrens. You've had multiple. The Empire's been responsible for multiple genocides, willingly stepped into and committed multiple genocides, and it's not listed as a theme warning, as a content warning, right on the website, but it's talked about. But I think if you showed that Calvari's End content warning list to new players, I think that would
Mm.
help with them opting them into this is unfair, this is going to be shit, there's going to be some really hard things to talk about at this game. If you don't want to do that, it's probably the wrong game for you. As opposed to if you don't want to do that, don't worry about it. There'll be a section for you over here that doesn't have those themes. But no matter how much you say that or you want that to be true, it doesn't stop role player Johnny X coming up to you and talking about the Winds of War, the Winds of Fortune, the stuff that characters would talk about in that setting. And then, of
Mm.
course, talking about the Barons or talking about what's going on in Madruga and the like, those themes will come up to you. And I imagine that must be really jarring for people who aren't expecting it. They understand what's going on. They go, oh shit, we're the baddies. Oh, that changes my character arc entirely. That change. Oh, am I playing this right? Am I not playing this right? Is this something to rail against? Does this even make sense to rail against? When you consider people's attitudes in Anvil, I imagine
Yeah.
they must contrast very strongly to the peasants of the Empire who are fundamentally highly religiously indoctrinated, militant, and imperialistic, which I don't think many citizens would turn around and describe themselves as in Anvil.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's kind of 2 points around that. I mean, one, I've forgotten who did it. It might have been Tim, from League Tim Baker, but someone actually worked out the maths of like the equivalent of an Imperial soldier versus a Roman era legionary, and the maths is astonishing, right? I mean, the casualties the Empire sustains on a yearly basis leads to a truly horrifying like society because effectively you have everyone from the age of about 16, 17 until they're like mid 40s is in the military. right? Apart from the very elite, right? There's no other way of being able to sustain this. Now, obviously, this is way below the abstraction layer, but that leads to a basically a Spartan era society where the only people really left in villages are the very old and the invalid and children, right? I mean, that's basically it. Everyone else is basically in the army, and you're having to do mass scale, almost industrial production of weaponry. Um, perhaps another akin would be kind of the expansion of Alexander the Great and kind of the Greek Empire. This was ruinous on so many aspects. Like it's not sustainable in the long term. I mean, putting aside kind of icy questions of the empire's war fronts or whatever, but that has truly horrifying consequences for a society,
Mm.
right? By our modern moral standards. So that's a key point. The empire is not a good thing by our OC moral standards now.
Mm.
The empire in its era, you have to look at its era, right? It is a collection. I suppose you could say confederacy of interests, but it's imperial rather than a confederacy. So, they have nations bound by a same currency, common cause, legal system, religion, and so on. But they are in a very, very hostile, dangerous world they're surrounded on all sides by opponents. You don't really forget reason, forget science. Not quoting Warhammer at you here, but
In the
it's
grim
kind of
darkness of the far fantasy.
right.
Yeah.
It's a pretty grim world, and particularly when you look at things like magic, for example, right? One of the reasons Imperial armies suffer casualties is that the average citizen in Anvil has access to healing, but soldiers don't. You don't have the availability of doing mass healing to your army, right? You can heal your army, and that's specifically army qualities, but you don't have crystal mana. Crystal mana is way beyond your average person's ability to afford, right? I mean, that's like a crown a go, if not more. That's a month's wages, according to the Imperial financial records. So, do you have a month's wages on you on the battlefield to be able to afford and to find someone who can heal you? No. So actually, in reality, you're going to be suffering horrific levels of seriously injured casualties. Um, so one of the problems with the kind of the Empire setting is that it is a grimdark world. You have a parallel dimension, or however many you want to call it, to ask someone who plays a mage, with very dangerous demigod-like figures, which are the Eternals. They have capabilities far beyond comprehension, like teleportation, as we saw with the Cold Sun, being able to move armies. They are, whether or not they're functionally mortal or immortal is a good question. That kind of thing. And you have a proven religion, right? I mean, like, think of the real world, how terrifying it would be if you were able to prove that your religion was real,
Mm.
right? You are a fundamentalist. There is no question that there is an alternative, right? It's real, right? You can literally hear the voices of your ancestors. If you're an orc, they're real. They will directly talk to you. This isn't like some ghosts in an echo. They're directly talking to you, and they can answer your questions. In a similar way, you can directly engage with people in the Empire who can remember past lives, right? Or can remember there are records of people who have done that. So that's super interesting, and the effect in society. Imperial society, if you really peel it away, is nothing like the modern world in any way. You have a very militarized, very factionalized, extremely what's the term I'm looking for? Fatalistic society. If you are reborn again, death has a very different connotation to it, right? Obviously, it's different per nation, but that is a very, very extreme society, and I think I certainly would not want to live in the Empire if it was a real world.
Absolutely. And when it's you, I don't know if you ever pitch this to your mates and you say, oh, we basically just hang out in the field for a weekend, have some beers, and they're like, it's very casual.
Mm.
The reality is, sure you can experience that, but what's going on around you is this utterly grim, dark imperial war machine grinding its way across a continent. But you're blissfully unaware of what's going on. Again, a great analogy for the modern world when you look at ourselves in the UK, physically very secure and safe, and then you compare that to what's going on in Eastern Europe. It's a parable, but perhaps not a pleasant one, and certainly not one that I imagine people want to run into by accident at an event. And that's why I feel the setting these expectations is so important. Is Grimdark World themes, from Calvari's End, copy paste them onto the wiki and say this is what you're going to be engaging with. Get ready. And if you want to rail against those, you want to change it, go for it. But be aware that these kind of themes are going to crop up. They're, I don't want to say unavoidable. They're almost there, but technically, if you stay in your camp with your mates, you don't talk to anyone about them. Sure, they don't crop up. But if you're going to play the game as intended, in the spirit of the game, the social contract, right? Then those things are going to crop up. Especially if you start to play, we've talked about being a general, being a senator, being a cardinal. You could pursue that position all you want, and you get it. But then at that point, as part of the hat itself, not your role play, but the hat, you're going to run into those themes. You're going to be the one making those decisions. And I really hope that people joining Empire or getting into those positions in Empire are aware of what they're signing up for. Fingers crossed.
I think
That's my hope for
I think
2025.
that's
Rather than just
yeah.
removing it from the game, which is the other alternative, of course, but that would just rob it of all flavour and interest, just to be blunt.
I think that's one of the hardest issues, right? I mean, I'm going to deliberately be quite provocative on this point. You mentioned the term genocide, and that's something that's often thrown around Empire of like terms of war crimes, of genocide. These have no meaning in Empire. There is no international law. There is no very few international treaties, I mean, apart from arguably the Liberty Pact. They don't exist. And there's no concept of genocide as we would define it legally. So genocide is really important, has a legal definition in our society, and that's not something that exists in the Empire, and it's not something that existed throughout much of human history, right? I mean, if you are Genghis Khan, you are a warlord, Alexander the Great, you are Attila the Hun, etc. Your options when you come into contact with another society are basically threefold. You can remove them by kicking them out of their country and basically moving them on as migration or refugee. You can integrate with them. That has a whole series of issues around integration in terms of identity and nationalism and so on. Or you eradicate them. Right, that's basically throughout history. That has been the question about human societies interact with each other. Right, now, fortunately, in the modern world, most societies we try and settle our differences with each other. Be that through legal courts, be that through sports competition, be that through protests, be that by arguing, whatever it might be, right? But that has not been the case throughout much of human history, and is not the case in the Imperial world. So, you mentioned the Raven, for example. The Raven are a faction of orcs. They would be, a tribe, for example, of Native Americans or Central Asian steppes, or arguably like the Iceni in Britain would perhaps be a least controversial one. I'd say like they are like the equivalent of the Iceni tribe in Britain when the Romans came into contact with them. And so, did the Romans annihilate the Iceni? Yes, they did. And did some elements of Iceni culture survive? I'll leave that to the archaeologists. But the fact is that it is throughout human history when empires come in contact with groups of people, there's normally a series of very difficult questions get raised about this. But it is also worth highlighting that the empire is an expansionist theocracy, and in real world history, a theocracy has rarely, if ever, gone willingly into integration with a non-aligned religious, with a group that doesn't have the same shared religion.
Mm.
And so, one of the hardest things I find with Empire is the Raven are a really difficult question because they're a background kind of that they're a non-played faction. They exist only in the background. They're sitting effectively on a whole series of resources that the Empire needs for its war effort. And without going into IC agendas here, the Empire is facing a very, very serious problem on its war fronts. It's running out of armies. It is chewing through people very quickly. It is facing a realistic prospect of a major war front collapsing and territory starting to fall. And as soon as that happens, there is a very risk of kind of a domino effect of the kind of imperial economy collapsing and armies disbanding. And so the Brass Coast is a good example of that, where the Brass Coast has always been on the kind of absolute, it's sort of on the razor's edge of actually losing armies because they're not able to sustain them. They are suffering attrition all the time because they can't resupply them, because they don't have enough people and enough territory to resupply their armies. So this is a very real risk at the Empire. And the difficulty is with the Raven, they are a minor faction in the background. They are played by a couple of NPCs on the field, but they occasionally for kind of plot delivery, but they're not played by actual characters.
Hmm. They're one of
And
like, was it 6 or 7 different tribes that were
yeah,
actually in the Barrens prior to Dawn? Oh, I would say the Empire, but Empire led by Dawn showing up a couple of years ago before we really started attacking the Barrens. 2.5 years, maybe.
right. And so the Raven are great as a kind of plot mechanism. They're fantastic to add depth to the world. But it's been really interesting to see how the players have interacted with them. So we've had the similar kind of VAR with the Great Forest Orcs, right? I mean, that they've gone from being a minor faction to actually being quite a lot of plot around them.
Mm.
And that's great. And I'm not going to opine on kind of, icy opinions of whether we should or shouldn't be allying with particular groups or not. But it's just worth noting that this is player action that the Raven matter, right? This is not PD deciding that the Raven matter. The PD are going like, okay, well, we're going to have these groups there. It's up to the Empire how they wish to engage with them. And to just factually, Dawn tried to engage with the Raven, right? They tried converting them, they tried trading with them, they tried kind of negotiating with them, right? Now, at this point, real world history would say this is not going to go well for the Raven. And I think this is the difficult moment we have now with the kind of Griffin's Pride question in Empire, in that just purely from a logical perspective, what the Griffin's Pride have done is entirely in keeping with a martial expansionist theological empire, right? That
Mm.
is a perfectly logical conclusion. We're going to go and we're going to wipe them out. Now, again, just to highlight, this is not a war crime and it's not genocide, and we need to remove this language from Empire. It's extremely uncomfortable to talk about it. It's extremely uncomfortable. We are equating theoretical characters in a theoretical world with theoretical death with real world actual loss of life. And that I think is it's really uncomfortable if you've ever had any experience or family members of yours have been involved in real world history where this is played out. I'm very mindful that there are people on the field who have been directly have family members who've been caught up in war crimes or indeed experienced the consequences of ethnic cleansing or genocide.
Mm.
Far more people than you think would actually be who are actually on the field. But what's interesting is a lot of players are also saying, like, we're really not comfortable with the OC injection that this is directly being conflated with real world current conflicts, right? This is a theoretical game with theoretical, these are imaginary people, imaginary action, and imaginary crimes, if they are crimes. But also, it's completely negating the argument that this is a logical action by a general for his army to secure resources for his people for the Empire to survive. And I think that argument is largely being lost because at the moment it's being equated with the Raven have to survive. They are the victim. This is effectively ethnic cleansing going on in the game. Ergo, it cannot be allowed to happen. And I think that's completely missing the nuance and the point of this. And it's great if you want to play a moral character in the Empire. It's great if you want to change this. But do so, certainly if I was to do that, I would look at it from a how am I going to do that within the actual world itself. I'm going to be a moral character because I ardently believe the best way of achieving ambition is not to kill loads of people, it's to convert them and make them prosperous, right? We make our country better, but that's my ambition, is to convert everybody to ambition, right? So do the kind of moral crusade element from within the game mechanic rather than just coming in and going like this immediately equates to real world ethnic cleansing or genocide, but it doesn't. These are imaginary people and it's extremely insulting to equate them. But that's a really difficult issue that's happening at the moment where players are deliberately choosing to kind of equate the Raven with real world events,
Mm.
ignoring the fact that this is an imaginary game and imaginary factions, but also they're not engaging with the actual religion that would allow them to be able to have that position. There's one thing to say, I morally disagree with this and I'm going to campaign against it based on modern morals. Great, that's not a particularly interesting story. You're not keeping with the game world. It's something else to go, you are fundamentally wrong, General of the Griffin's Pride, because you are lacking wisdom. We could have converted them, right? That is a perfectly valid and fantastic roleplay position to take, right? And by all means, play that out to the nth degree, however far it goes. But that I think it's lazy to just use modern morality into a fantasy world.
Mm. And also doesn't take into account the people who are playing in the spirit of the game. When we hit this, let's call it an OC barrier, right? An OC hurdle. For the players who stop there and say we don't want to progress further, fair play. It's a hobby. But what about the players who want to go over that hurdle? And because it's a communal game with thousands of players on the pitch, if these kind of avenues of role play, I was going to say discovery actually. I think with PvP, especially on the political scale, these kind of questions, you've got your OC morals in the background, but watching how to tackle and change a system when you are the person who's different, you're the minority, you're the one who's like your example there of ambition. Everyone else in the room is like, right, let's just knock this chess piece off the board, and you think, no, OC, I'm not, I don't want to do that. Let's find it like your IC example there. Let's switch them all to ambition instead. Let's get them on the side. That's a much more interesting way to play it. And taking that route as well, all the other people who are in that tent baying for blood, their role play is just as valid. And at that point, both sides are winning, in my opinion, because both sides are getting role play and they're both playing in the spirit of the game. The problem with catering to people who don't want to cross the hurdle, despite this being a theme of the a stated theme of the game, is that suddenly the people across from you who are baying for blood, there's an OC question mark that immediately gets put on them, despite the fact all they've done as players is played the game as intended. But then this hurdle appears, they jump it, other people don't, and suddenly there might be some questions over their OC opinions, their OC alignments, right? Which I don't think is fair or healthy at all for a game. And all of this could easily be avoided with some clear expectation setting.
Yeah, but you hit the nail on the head there, Chris. I mean, I think that is a fundamental problem in that it's a really difficult line to follow, because if someone is consistently playing an evil character, why, right? But also, is that character evil? And I think, as I like stories where there is no good or evil, right? It's shades of grey. And it's perfectly valid for our characters to disagree on certain things and agree on others. That's like real life, and it makes the world believable. But if you want to play an antagonistic character, and I think this is me being really, really clear, antagonistic characters are a fundamental requirement of any story and lore, right? If we don't have them, there is no friction, there is no story, right? If we all just get along and therefore we're going to go march on the enemy and we're going to kill them all and that's what we'll all agree on, it's boring. Right, if the good guys always win, there's no story, right? Literally be a 3-page, not even that 3-line book. And the equation that just because someone's playing antagonistic means they are an antagonistic person, or they are morally questionable, or they are unethical, or they're just a dick in real life, isn't true. And I think there's a really dangerous fallacy there of people kind of going down the line of saying like, oh well, I don't want to play with this person because they're an edgelord, or they're being really aggressive, or they're clearly playing this kind of person. The best role players I know are brilliant for being antagonistic, and they're not loud, they're not hyper aggressive, they're not bullying. Characters might do elements of this, but they're far more nuanced as characters, right? And that makes so much like, does my character agree with this? Like, do I want to work with you? Like, we fundamentally disagree with this. Should I become your friend and backstab you? Those type of questions are fantastic. But I think, particularly the problem with festival systems is you have these kind of two sort of camps, as it were, of people. You've got people who just want to go out and relax and have a good time, right? They want to go to the festival, get your gaming tokens, go and spend them on cake and beer and whatever, and chill out, right? And that's perfectly valid as a playstyle. That's great. You just want to chill out on the weekend and have joy. Equally, there are people who want to play. They want to play The Witcher 3 on mega hard mode, right? Where if you die, you've lost the game, right? And that's equally a valid playstyle. And there's no right or wrong answer to that question. But what there is a degree of commonality in that everyone should have the courtesy to buy into the system. And if you don't want to be involved in that element of the game, you should be able to say, like, sorry, this isn't my jam. I want to go over here and do something else. And that's cool. Without demeaning those people who want to play on those harder themes, those harder issues. I mean, you mentioned kind of Cavalry's End. I agree with you. I think a lot of these things should be in the game, but that would, A, not appeal to everybody. And secondly, I think one of the hardest issues I have with kind of the darker themes in LARP is you've got to have a sufficient overview and training of people, not training, but experience of people to understand how you interact with that. So one of the big differences between UK and American and European LARPs is a lot of European LARPs require you to do workshops on how to engage with adult themes in a way that's sensitive. that means they can say explicitly we are going to be dealing with racism or socialism or nationalism or religious issues or whatever it might be. And this is how we are going to control this within the game, or this is how you can going to put your hand up and opt out of it, or how we'd fizz rep it, or whatever it might be. And I think in a way, everyone going through that process and putting in very clear expectations around the conduct that you should do and how you roleplay these darker themes, I think would be a massive step up for a lot of games.
Mm. And circling back to, I think maybe almost 40 minutes ago at this point,
Mm.
um, on the on Menhirs Fate, I think we both touched on the point of it being exciting, but it might change other systems. Do you think that the above we've just talked about? Do you think that's going to change at Menhirs Fate? Do you think people are going to buy into that social contract more wholeheartedly because it's better at setting expectations? Or do you think we're going to see more of the same, and despite the best intentions of the game team, it's the player base has self-policed itself, you could say, or um, self-controlled. There's a proper word for it, and I can't remember it, but they found a way to effectively enforce their own set of game terms and a social contract. And it doesn't matter who makes a game or what game they make, it's always going to revert back to what we have at the moment.
Good question. I think there's a kind of couple of issues that I think are going to need to kind of play out, and I'm going to call spade a spade on this one. I think one of the hardest issues that I'm aware of with Menhirs Fate is a lot of players. There's a general view that people want to get into the game as early as possible so that they can have that first mover advantage, right? A lot of people are really unhappy with how long Empire or LT or CP have been going for, and the fact that people who've been playing this game for a long time have an inherent advantage because they know people, they know OC, they have a lot of mates across the field. Even if your character dies, you can go and find a new group really easily because you've got mates in other nations. You know how the game works, you know how to operate within it, and so on. And that is a massive advantage. And I'm not remotely dismissing that from people's kind of views on it's unfair. It is unfair. You are coming to the game new, therefore you have a very hard learning curve ahead of you compared to someone who's been playing for a decade. But at the same time, one of the issues with Menhirs Fate is that I'm getting the kind of perception a lot of people want to play it because they want to be in their own, a quote someone said to me the other day is in at the front door first. They want to be at the party first so they can get to the bar first and get, the nice stuff. And I think that's going to be a bit of a friction with playing a more nuanced game. I mean, one of the problems of the festival system is that, disadvantages, you can't really go into like really hyper immersive worlds because you might be dropping £1,000 on amazingly beautiful Varushkan armor. I'm brand new and I don't have that kind of disposable income. So you're always going to have issues around the level of immersion, the level of experience in LARP, the sort of understanding of what is and is not socially acceptable within LARP. There's a whole separate podcast you could do around IC relationships, for example, and the very thorny problem there around consent and how things work within that. So Menhirs Fate, I don't think is going to fundamentally change the paradigm. Is what I'm getting to. It's not going to be fundamentally different from Empire in that respect of suddenly being in like really into loads of adult themes. What I think it is that it's able to be much more explicit about what is in the game from the get-go, which Empire hasn't been able to do, and as Empire is now in a position where it's struggling to keep up with social values and social views that have evolved since it was written. So Menhirs Fate is its rules and its system is at the moment of the time it was created. So it's far more reflective of modern values and modern considerations than even just 10 years ago. And that's the problem that Empire's facing, is it's needing to evolve as the player base, the majority of the player base are evolving. Menhirs Fate is a much more modern system, so therefore is able to kind of do that from the get-go. So yeah, there will definitely be pockets of kind of people wanting into the harder themes, and I think that's fantastic. And I think in any game you go looking for it. But I certainly wouldn't be saying you're going to see a massive, massive kind of wholly new adult-themed game, because you're not.
Do you think that it's almost like Menhirs Fate is a refresh, if you will, a refresh last. It literally is it is a fresh system, and it's going to be able to keep up with the social values that evolved over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years for games like LT, CP, Empire, right? Do you think for those older systems, it's going to force them to do a refresh or some kind of radical overhaul.
I hope so. I really do, and I really hope that it forces the game, out of just sheer competition, right? I mean, let's be honest. If you do Menhirs Fate and ILARP and you go to Empire and you do any other game, you're looking at like 30, 40 days off a year minimum without even going any other form of holiday.
Yep, I
And
can confirm it is 31 days you would need for those to take Thursday, Friday, and Monday off because I've just had the argument with my manager.
there we go.
Yeah,
See,
today.
from
Yeah.
the horse. Right. So that is a lot of time, a lot of money, and let's be honest, you want to have your own kit because we all want to have great kit, and it's great. Um, and so I think that inherently leads to competition. And one of the, if I'm crystal ball gazing right now, I don't think all of them are going to survive. I don't think the market's big enough to have LTCP, Empire, and Menhirs Fate all in the same year. I think we are starting to reach market saturation point. So I think Menhirs Fate is great, and it will be a really new take and a really good opportunity. But I think it's going to, the bulk of the players will have to kind of decide which the game they want to prioritize, and that's great because it means we'll have complete diversity of the marketplace. If you want to do, if you want to have that kind of much great, the guild system, and you want to have more PvE theme, and you want to have kind of a bright new system where you might be able to have opportunities to do things in a different way that you can't in older systems, then Menhirs Fate might be your game, right? If you want to play with a darker type take on a religious theocracy expanding across the world in the face of annihilation, then Empire's your game, right? If you want to have a more plug and play system, then LT's your bag, right? I don't know much about CP. I've never been, but it's apparently fantastic, and that has again a take on LT, but a much more kind of nuanced and more developed take than LT does. So they're not meant to be the same. They're meant to appeal to different people, and I think that's the cool thing about having Menhirs Fate is it is going to force competition. It is going to make game systems reconsider how both the back end wiring, how does God operate, how does your character get generated, all that kind of stuff, but also the front of house stuff, and that we should start to see a bit of a diversification of what players want in the marketplace. You really want to play football on the weekend. I want to play rugby, right? We both enjoy sports. We're good mates, but end of the day, we fundamentally want to do different sports, and that is a good thing.
Mm. And do you think with Men's Fate is I believe it's renting a large festival site for its events, but
Hmm.
obviously we've heard today that this is our last. Is it today or yesterday? But this is going to be our last year at Dadford before PD moved to their new permanent site that's just north of London, I think, or maybe southwest of Cambridge. I can't remember the exact location. I think they're trying to keep it under wraps, but the point it's in the southeast, somewhere local enough to London
We're
to get
talking
for me to get to.
Midlands rather than southeast, but yeah,
Um, North of the M25.
yeah, north of the M25.
North of the M25. That's nice and vague. So, do you think that that might be a faux pas? And it's a shame. It's a faux pas not because of a deliberate misstep, but just because of the timing. When with your crystal ball there, Men's Fate comes in. Let's say it takes 10% of PD's player base, who no longer attend PD events because Menhirs Fate has the game for them that they didn't get at PD, let's say. But what we also see is that the exponential growth that PD have had over the last 5 years. Yeah, 5 years post COVID, right? That's going to plateau. And I wonder if PD have bought that site on the assumption that that growth is going to continue.
I mean, good question. I'll be honest and say I don't actually think the kind of current model of PD and Empire is working because we're all new sometime, right? And new players are the lifeblood of the hobby. But the sheer number of brand new players in a single system becomes a lot of issues, right? And Empire is creaking badly under the sheer volume of people, right? Doesn't matter if you're experienced or not. Like it's simple stuff like logistically, God has a massive queue, right? I mean, the small mini gods they set up now in Empire has been the result of the fact we've seen 2,500 players or whatever it's been in the last 7 years have arrived even new, and they all have needs to access God, and that kind of stuff. And it suddenly means that if you're playing, say, a priest character, you're to go and register testimonies. That'll take 45 minutes, right?
Mm.
So in a way, you can't multi-qualify. You can't be a warrior and a priest because you basically have to guarantee that you're basically writing down in a book and then we'll go to God at some point during the day and take 45 minutes to go and register testimonies. So, my character is a priest doing all I got to do. I will literally do like 10, 15 testimonies or however many people have spent LoW on because it's a cool roleplay thing. But I'll have to like diarize that in my day, right? And I'll try and do it when God's quieter. But Empire is creaking badly under the number of players because you need the number of volunteers, you need the number of plot runners, you need referees, you need combat crew, you need the size of skirmishes,
You
and all
need
that kind
admin
of
crew
stuff.
as well. That's a good point. It's just
Right.
come to my mind is those people who spend their weekends crewing that prop up
Yep.
Empire. Was it 400-500 crew in theory?
Yep.
What's going to happen to them?
And
They get
that's
a shift to Menhirs as well.
100%. And I think that's the really difficult question, Chris, in all of this is, this is really difficult. In the crew are also a finite amount. You've got to be a very special kind of person who's willingly giving up your weekend for free to not necessarily hang around with just your mates, but to create game for other people. That's quite a lot to ask from people. So yes, there will be crew competition. I'm personally hopeful that we'll see more players doing. We'll see a kind of smoothing out of the influx of new LARPers across the different systems, and then people will start cherry picking what game is for them, right? And that to me is fantastic because I want to be able to go like, this is the game I want to play a really serious character. This is the game I want to just chill out and have fun with my mates and hit things with a rubber sword. Or this is the game I want to go and crew and be an evil wizard or whatever it is. And that's fantastic. And this isn't a dig at Empire, and it's not a dig at Menhirs Fate. It's just that scaling anything for large numbers of players quickly is extremely hard. And is PD making a bad decision with hiring with their new site? No, far from it. I'd say if anything, you highlighted that Menhirs Fate are hiring a new site, are hiring a location. In theory, you could run a Menhirs Fate from the site PD is buying. So, what PD is trying to do is to create a new LARP site, and I think that's to be really encouraged and is really fantastic, and will actually solve a lot of the issues I've just mentioned about expansion of the player base, which will really fix some of those issues and indeed allow Empire to develop and grow and fix a lot of its problems at the moment. So yeah, I'm really excited about Menhirs Fate coming on. I think it will massively shake up the market and really allow those existing LARPs to also evolve. Because they're going to need to keep their players interested and kind of keep renewing what is it that people want to keep coming back for.
I'm almost feeling like from a government point of view, investing in infrastructure is expensive and slow. It comes with risk, but long term, clear and bountiful benefits, and maybe that'll be the same with PD's site. But I really, perhaps it could turn out well. You see it if people talk about the good old days, right? Of when the system was a little bit smaller, there was a little bit more. There's more physical space on the field for your camps, but also political space, military space. There's fewer people going for each role. Maybe if we see like evening out of players, not even just new players, but all players across Menhirs Fate, if that takes 1,000, 2,000 people out of the pool, then Empire might return back to its 1,500 roots. So it'll need less. It can get by with less crew, and the people playing it, there'll be more, concerted competition for hats, for example. Long-term rivals rather than having 100 people crowding on a position. It might be 10, for example. So it could be good. It could be good for their system. And I've got fond memories of 2015 and 2016 Empire when skirmish was 40 minutes long. They had 3 separate distinct phases to them. You'd go on the field, fight a bunch of orcs, go into the woods, stealth section past a monster, and then ambush some kind of princeling, kill them, and then extract. It's basically Tarkov, but there's 40 of you for 40 minutes doing it, rather than 70 of you pile driving into a clearing where the crew have just dusted themselves down from an absolute smacking that Wintermark have delivered to them, and then you just do the exact same thing to them, which is, don't get me wrong, it's still fun, but the prior example was more fun. maybe we could go back to that. Who knows? Maybe that's my hope. I've talked a lot about hope for Menhirs Fate,
Mm.
and I think that hope is well founded. Maybe taking some players out of the pool is actually going to be good for these other systems. For CP and LT, I haven't played them myself, so I don't know what their space issues are like or logistic issues are like. But if it's anything like Empire, then maybe taking some pressure out of the system is a good thing.
Change. I mean, there's two ways of looking at it, right? I mean, do you think change is a good thing or a bad thing? And I think for me, yes, we can always criticize and say, back in the day, back in my day, certain things are better, and they probably were in some aspects. But equally, some stuff is a lot better now. I mean, I have memories of. I'm going to show my age here now. I have memories of Empire at tournament stud that was it was a lake when it rained, right? And I'm talking like you'd have water running through the door of your tent. Um, yes, the battles might have been a lot more kind of the skirmishes might have been a bit longer, but you didn't have the scale of Anvil, right? I mean, when you're standing at the top of the hill and where we are now and Dadford and actually looking down at the kind of evening twilight and seeing the firelight going on, I mean, that is awe-inspiring,
Mm.
right? You didn't get that at Tournament Stud. You didn't get the variety of traders. You didn't get the size of the battles and all that kind of stuff. So change is always a mixed blessing. It's good and bad. And the same I think with considering where Menhirs Fate will go, there'll be some stuff that Menhirs Fate will be absolutely smashing out the park, and I know for a fact that they are doing some really really cool, exciting stuff. But equally, there'll be some elements that will just be a bit difficult to begin with, and normally those kind of issues will work their way through. But my plea for anybody going to Menhirs Fate for the first time is just give it time to iron out all the little gremlins, because this is the first time that this system will kick off. It will have a whole lot of logistical problems that you can't really know what you're doing, and some of it's unique to every site, right? Or like, oh, the Wi-Fi goes down. Do you have a backup? No, because the Wi-Fi backup is with Bob. Bob's had a car accident, right? All that kind of stuff will happen. So I'd really encourage people to give Menhirs Fate a bit of leeway, certainly begin with, to learn those lessons. And with PD, the same thing will happen when we move to a new site, right? I mean, it's going to have to relearn everything. The battles will be different. They need to plant trees and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think don't always just be an old guy and look back on the good stuff of in the past. There was also some stuff that frankly really sucked.
Oh yeah, definitely. Okay, so any closing remarks? We're running at 1 hour and 12 minutes and 22 seconds. I think my theme for this year is hope and
Hmm.
optimism, certainly for Menhirs Fate. But you know what, mate? I think you've changed my mind a little bit today, Dave. I think actually that I thought some of those, the issues above we've discussed around Empire are gonna stay the same slash get worse as it loses players and it loses its revenue potentially, and for investing in their site and losing their crew, losing the players, it very negative mental space. But actually, it could help them out. It could, as part of that change, it can make it easier for them to implement that change and fundamentally deliver a better game for all of us. But what about you? What's your hope, your optimism for 2025 in terms of LARP?
Uh, I think for me it's a year of change. So I'm really got a lot of hope, and I'm really excited about trying out some new cool projects. So um, I get to try and kill the characters and Menhirs Fate is one of the skirmish crew, which is going to be really fun. I know I'm not giving you any secrets away with this, but it's going to be really fun and very different dynamic from Empire, and there will be an announcement on that very soon
Oh,
about
very
how
soon.
some of the kind of combat might work. But that's really exciting and really fun, and I think Menhirs Fate is going to be really really cool and a very different dynamic to Empire. Empire wise, I've got a really interesting kind of arc coming to an end with my current character, which is really interesting. Lots of questions about group dynamics, and with you as part of it, as a really good mate of mine at Empire, loads of really interesting questions coming up with Empire, which is fantastic around. Some of these issues, like what is going to be the fallout of the Raven question, how is that actually going to play out in an IC mechanic, is going to be fascinating. And then equally, I'm also just really excited about the whole lot of like random smaller LARPs. So I'm doing Heirs of the Dragon in Poland, which is in an actual castle where I get to play kind of one of the Stark Bannermen about 100 years before Game of Thrones, the series kicked off. That's going to be really difficult, and I've got a really, really hard character brief where I'm playing an absolute brute. Very, very adult themes. I'm abusive to my sister. I was abused as a child. Like this is going to be very, very hard roleplay, but I'm excited about that. And I'm also doing one called 99 Poets, where
Or
I'm
Revachol,
basically
right?
playing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of playing as one of the kind of factions, and that's going to be really interesting as well. I mean, I absolutely love rolling the sort of Czech company who run not so Poets, but also Revachol and Legion, and I've got the name of the other one now. But they run a whole series of really, really good European LARPs. So yeah, loads of really cool LARP, loads of really cool stories, and finally, it's also just going to be playing random fun crew at Eversley, which I just adore because you just get to play so much fun. And I'd recommend it if anyone's listening to this, give Eversley a go, give crewing a go. If you don't know anything, just come along. Like there's a really, really good bunch of people, Johnny and Kizzy, who run Eversley, and indeed are crucially running a lot of Menhirs Fate as directors.
Hmm.
They're absolutely brilliant at helping give people an understanding and a leg up and getting into the world. And once you kind of thrown yourself into the deep end, you will adore it and you'll love creating stories for other people. So yeah, thanks very much for your time, mate.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for you at home, in the car, or on top of a building. The third one, less likely than the others, for listening. Thank you very much. We're going to cut off there, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.